1800s America, a blooming place around 8 million people. With the end of the wars in 1815, the transport systems were expanded, a national bank created, and economy blossomed. People raised their own food. Corn and beans were common in the north, cows provided milk, butter, and beef, while in the south, venison and other game provided most of the meat. But with the boom in industrialization, things started taking a turn. People weren't able anymore to produce their own food in the city, which led to the mass production of food to support the rising needs. It's important to remember that at the time, the living conditions were much different. Coal was the main source of energy in the 1900s. Home refrigeration was introduced in the 1910s, and electricity was still becoming mainstream. These factors and more make it difficult to store food for the long time and to distribute it to the growing population of the cities. So factories had to draw from all the resources they had to make this process fast and cost effective. They wanted to sell more food for cheap and make sure the food they made lasts for longer. So what did they do? They started putting fillers in it. Now, don't get me wrong, fillers in food have been used since the 1700s with sawdust in bread. I can make a whole separate video on just this topic, but it wasn't until the mass industrialization of food that this process became mainstream. Also, keep in mind that before the FDA, food companies weren't required to label the ingredients on their packaging. That's how parents ended up using products such as Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which led to their kids' death because it contained morphine and alcohol. Yes, morphine and alcohol in very high concentrations. Now, I know you're probably wondering what type of toxic materials were they putting into this food? And here's what I found. Formaldehyde was commonly used as a preservative for milk, meat, and beer, possibly in combination with borax to help keep things fresh. Chalk and plaster was mixed into flour and bread to increase weight and bulk, and lead salts, aka sugar of lead, as sweeteners. For artificial coloring, which became very prevalent at the time with the increase of food industrialization, cheese was dyed with red lead and sweets were colored green with copper arsenide. Now, as you may know, all these things are not safe to consume, and the same was the case back then as well. Slowly, people were noticing the effect this food was having on their health, with the rates of obesity, disease, and death exponentially rising. They started demanding the government to do something. It wasn't until Upton Sinclair came up with his novel The Jungle that the government actually did something about it. In his novel, his aim was to bring light to the harsh living conditions of immigrants at the time. However, the public grabbed on to the details that he exposed about the meat industry and used that as fuel for their outcry to the government. I'll tell you one piece of information that was found in the book to give you context. It said rotten meat and poisoned rats were knowingly ground up, canned, and sold to customers. Another key factor to the creation of the FDA was Harvey Wiley. If you're like me, you probably hadn't heard about him before, but he was key to the implementation of the first stages of the FDA. After he was appointed chemist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, he allocated some of the department funds to investigate food adulteration. His findings were being published time and time again, but not much change was happening. In 1895, he chaired a committee of the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists to develop a national anti-adulteration law, but no results were seen for years. The bill pushed for honest labeling and prohibited harmful adulteration, but even though it gained such support, no change was seen for years. He continued his research, even created something called the Poison Squad. This was a group of 12 men who, in exchange for free meals and $5 a month, volunteered to eat this food for him to record his findings. The food was carefully monitored by Wiley. He decided what type and the amount of additive that went into the food. The first one tested was borax, which was so common at the time, Wiley deemed it to be the safer of the additives. Before the fifth round of rotations was delivered to groups, half of the participants dropped out, citing headaches and stomach aches. After the release of his studies, the government, with the backing of President Theodore Roosevelt, passed the Pure Food and Drugs Act, also known as the Wiley Act, which enforced product labeling, prohibited the transportation of unlawful food and drugs, and more. The resources are in the description where you can do a deep dive into everything that I'll mention. The fight didn't stop there. From before the passing of the act and after, so Wiley had to continuously fight these big food groups that had financial interest into producing this cheap food. Wiley couldn't stand anymore and left the USDA in 1912 to become the director of Good Housekeeping Bureau of Health and Sanitation. People now thought they were safe, but they weren't, as multiple scandals soon followed. Since cosmetics were completely unregulated still, women were putting on radium creams and tonics and even going blind from using eyelash dye that was made with toxic coal tar dye. The Supreme Court established that the law applied only to label ingredients and not false therapeutic claims, so these companies continued applying these false claims on their packaging. These and more led to the 1927 reorganization of the Bureau of Chemistry into the Bureau of Chemistry and Soils, focused on the scientific agricultural research, and the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, focused on regulation. By 1930, the latter was renamed to what we now know as the Food and Drug Administration. Another tragedy came to light, the death of 107 people, a lot of them kids, after drinking the elixir of sulfanilamide, which contained diethylene glycol, aka antifreeze, and caused terrible deaths. This caused for more regulation, leading to the passing of the 1938 Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. This law required drugs to be labeled with adequate directions for safe use and mandated pre-market approval and proof of safety. Now the FDA is completely established, working as a continuous regulator before the food make it into our home. But after its establishment, the scandals didn't stop. Have you heard of aspartame, the very popular sweetener found in candy and gum? During initial studies, 98 out of 196 mice died after exposure to the aspartame. Still, the sweetener was approved and remains popular to this day, despite people's negative testimonies and other research. Some main conflicts of interest couldn't go unnoticed. In an article by Virginia Tech Undergraduate Historical Review, it states, to this day, aspartame remains tremendously popular and the FDA stands by its claims. Another scandal involves the approval in 1995 of OxyContin, a pain management drug, which is a controlled-release version of oxycodone. Arguably, the approval of this drug went against FDA's own Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act, as the pill only studied on patients with life-limiting illness was not prescribed to anyone with discomfort. Let me tell you about a few steps they took to push OxyContin to the market. They targeted the highest physician prescribers, which was available to them through sophisticated marketing data that these companies have to target physician prescribers. In addition, they offered multiple salary increases and bonus incentives for their representatives selling OxyContin, and targeted doctors with multiple branded promotional items such as fishing nets and plush toys, which even for the Drug Enforcement Administration was weird doing this for a Schedule II opioid. These steps plus more took the company's sales from 4.5 million in 1996 to 1.1 billion in the 2000s, and also were one of the biggest stepping stones to the opioid crisis that follows us to this day. It also got me thinking of how intertwined the relationship between the FDA and Big Pharma is. I mean, in just this case, Dr. Curtis Wright, one of the lead approval doctors for OxyContin, went to work for Purdue after the controversy hit. All things considered, I'm not saying that the FDA is a terrible organization. I understand that the previous points I mentioned all have their positive and negative side, and I believe it has done great work making sure it's safe products that make it into the market. But seeing its deep ties with the same companies that produce these products, how safe are things really? And wouldn't it be easier for the FDA to be separated from this intertwined relationship? So even the doctors don't have so much pressure approving things that don't need to be approved. Thank you for going through this medical side of history with me. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.